Okay, welcome everyone, both in person and online. It's a pleasure to have you all here, and obviously we've got a less than pleasurable topic to talk about, the serious situation in Ukraine. So I wanted to start with some introductions. So first of all, for those that are online who aren't at Texas A&M, welcome to the Texas A&M School of Law through this virtual pop-up class, and to all of our students and faculty and staff who are here, welcome too. We thought we'd start just with some quick introductions of who we are, and then talk a little bit about what we're doing with this pop-up class, and then go into the substance of it. So I'm Cynthia Alkon. My colleague Charlotte Koo will start with an introduction of herself.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Professor Alkon, and welcome to our program. I am Charlotte Koo. I'm a professor here at Texas A&M School of Law. I'm also Director of Global Programs. But perhaps more relevant to what brings me to this program today is my many decades of involvement with aspects of international law, starting from student days, time that I spent in the United Nations Office of Legal Affairs, and subsequently in leadership positions at the American Society of International Law and at the Research Center for International Law at Cambridge University in England. In those particular positions, I've had the honor and the privilege of working with people who have had direct involvement in many of the institutions and laws that we'll be talking about today. Many of these individuals were compelled to do this work because of personal experiences and basically a commitment to getting the world to a better place, to relieve suffering, and if such cannot be done, then at least to try to punish and hold accountable countries and individuals who violate international law. So thank you for joining us today for this discussion, and thanks, Professor Alkon.
So I'm Cynthia Alkon. I'm Professor of Law here at Texas A&M and Director of our Criminal Law, Justice, and Policy program. And my experience is probably most relevant to the discussion we're having today is I spent 7 years living and working in Eastern Europe. 6 of those years were spent living next door to Ukraine. I spent 2 years living in Belarus, working for the American Bar Association, and 4 years living in Poland, working for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, where I was the head of the Rule of Law unit. And so my experiences and time in the region very much informs my thinking of what's going on there right now, and also is really a big part of why I wanted to have us do this pop-up class, because I wanted to make sure that for those, it started as just a small idea for our students, but for those that are here, to get a little bit of background of the region, of the country of Ukraine, to have a little bit better understanding of what's going on there in the context of what's gone on there in the past. So that's really our first goal of this class, is to just give an overview, make sure you have a little bit of a basic understanding. So those who are listening in who have more background in the region, please bear with us, right? We'll start with some basic information, and then we'll move on. And the second big goal was to make sure that everyone gets just a basic introduction to what of the international law matters here and what is relevant when we're talking about the situation in Ukraine. And so we will be going back and forth between Charlotte and myself as we talk about things fitting into these two big goals for our class today. And the goal also is to have enough time for questions and discussion. In terms of questions, those of you who are online, please put them into the chat, and we will be periodically checking that when we open it up for questions. And for those of you who are in the room, we've got a microphone here, so you can come up and speak into the microphone so everyone can hear you with your questions. Okay, so that's the basic housekeeping. And let us know, I tend to be a soft speaker, as does Professor Koo, so we've been getting signs to speak more loudly. If those online, if you need that to happen, let us know. We've got people in the room who are paying attention to that, so to give us those clues. So just let us know if there's a problem. Okay, so let's just get started with some of the basics. So just some basic facts. I think we all know that not even 2 weeks ago today, Russia invaded Ukraine. So it was February 24, 2022. The population of Ukraine, for those who are less familiar with it, it's 43 million. This is before the war and the large displacement of people that we will talk about as we get going here today. And in terms of just putting that in context, so that's larger than the state of Texas, where we sit now in terms of population. So Texas is 28 million compared to Ukraine's 43 million. It's also larger than the state of California, which has 39 million. And as I think we all know, those are our two most populated states in this country. So it is a more populated country than our two most populated states. Because we're sitting in a law school, I think it's also useful to put in context. Ukraine is a vibrant country, and it has everything that you would expect a vibrant country to have, including active law schools. This is just a partial list of the law schools in Ukraine. And for those who are sitting in law schools as teachers and as students, I think it's important to remember that 2 weeks ago in Ukraine, what we're doing day in and day out is what everyone who was at a law school in Ukraine was doing. They were attending classes, classes were being taught, they were trying to catch up with their reading, try to do their assignments, and then everything changed. And that is no longer the situation for any law school or any law student in Ukraine. And I think it's important to keep in mind that every part of normal life that we are able to enjoy here has been brought to a screeching halt because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Okay, so just to put us in a little bit of context in terms of, we're starting historically, this is Europe in the 1600s, so we're going way back in terms of looking at where Ukraine sat. And Europe, as I think we all know, has gone through a number of changes in terms of borders, and Ukraine has sat in the middle of a part of Europe that has gone through that a lot in its history and has been a site of war multiple times throughout its history. When we come to the more recent past, I also think it's important to remember the Soviet history, which I think for a lot of the people in this room predated your birth, which is hard for me to imagine, but it is true. So the Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991, but from 1917, with the revolution, up until 1991, this was the border of the Soviet Union, which included Ukraine. You can see it to the far west on this map. Included Belarus, included Latvia, Estonia, all of these places that are now independent countries were part of the Soviet Union, and not all of them were part in 1917, but by after World War II, all were part of the Soviet Union and remained so until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. And in terms of just getting a little bit better look into the region that we're talking about right now, I think maps are useful. It's useful in terms of thinking about some of the discussions we'll be having about refugees. If you look at where Ukraine sits, right, it's just to the south of Belarus. And then if you look all along the western border, it shares a large land border with Poland. And as we'll talk about, that's where a lot of refugees have been fleeing to since the war started. Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, and all of these countries have been getting a large number of refugees. And you can see geographically why. They're right on the border. It's a place where Ukrainians can get out for those that are able to get out to escape what's going on in Ukraine right now. And you can see, looking to the east, where Russia sits, and Belarus to the north, which is in an alliance with Russia, and through which troops have been moving. First they were amassing, and then they've been moving through Belarus also. I also think it's useful just to get a little bit of context. And so since we sit in Texas, we've got the Texas map over the Ukraine map. And what this shows is Ukraine is something like 85% the size of Texas. So we know Texas is a large state, large landmass, and Ukraine is too. And that's just important to keep in mind. We're not talking about a small country, either geographically or by population. I also think it's important when we're understanding what's going on there to have the context of NATO. NATO was obviously one of the big discussion points that's preceded the conflict. When you look at, these are the countries in purple, are Western European countries that were part of NATO before 1997. And then you can see in yellow all of the countries that have joined NATO since 1997, which includes basically every country on what was the borders of the Soviet Union. So Belarus hasn't and is in a politically very different place, which we can talk about if that's of interest. And Ukraine is obviously a big point of contention about their joining NATO. But you can see the rest of these countries since 1997 have become a part of NATO. As we know, right, the war started, and this is not going to be a talk about the military and the military strategy. This isn't our great areas of expertise or strength, but obviously we know that it's already shaping up to be extraordinarily brutal. We know that civilian casualties are high in the areas where there's been fighting, and we know that civilians have been targeted from what we've been seeing in news reporting, including civilians who are fleeing. We know there have been problems with safety corridors to get people out of areas where there's direct fighting. And there are a number of other things that we know that are relevant in terms of the discussion of where international law sits in this conflict and where it might sit as the conflict goes on.
Okay. So it is one of the ironies, I think, in international law, that sometimes international law is most visible at a moment when international law is being violated, both in terms of the law that's been violated, as well as the law that then applies once it has been violated, because other rules kick into place. So what is the law, and what are the consequences, and what really comes of this? But before moving to that, just a couple of things referring to the maps. If you think about the map and how Ukraine sits near Poland, near Russia historically, the populations are also blended, and many of them speak multiple languages. They may have families that cross borders and the like. So the current borders that we've been talking about in geopolitics matter, but nonetheless, for individuals and people personally, often they have relations that actually cross these borders, which makes the situation an even more difficult and intricate one. But as far as war is concerned, it has been a project since the beginning of the 20th century, so about just over 100 years ago, to restrict the use of war as a way to solve conflicts. So after World War I, there was a commitment made by countries at that time to basically go to what was called peaceful settlement of disputes prior to going to war. Now, it didn't ban war altogether. The commitment was that you would actually undertake some peaceful resolution strategies before going to war. And there was a League of Nations that oversaw all of this. So this is an international organization that was formed by a treaty which obligated members to these particular requirements of not going to war prior to taking some steps in peaceful settlement. Now, none of this works unless countries are prepared to enforce it, because you may have the law on the books, but who's going to stand up to enforce it? And in the case of World War I, for those of you who know history or have studied it, it was followed by World War II. So countries at that time were not able to stand up against Hitler, against the Japanese, and against the Italian aggressors in that particular conflict. So the idea in the course of World War II was that we should do better. We should do better, and so we're going to create a new organization. We're going to create a new organization with a little bit more heft behind it in order to enforce these obligations of not going to war. So in the United Nations, which is the international body today that's also most relevant in the midst of this conflict, we have a UN charter, another treaty that countries sign and basically accept their obligations when they become members of the UN. So what does the UN charter say? The UN charter also says you should not go to war as the first measure to undertake dealing with some conflict. You are obligated to undergo peaceful settlement of disputes. So that's negotiation, mediation, you can go to court, all kinds of things. But the UN, unlike the League of Nations, actually tries to make it costlier to go to war. And so they created a Security Council. Security Council given the primary authority, primary responsibility for maintenance of international peace and security. This privileged body of 15 members, the UN is made up of 193 members, 15 compose the Security Council, actually have authority to tell the world what to do. Now, within that 15, there are 5 members who are privileged. They're privileged because the idea was these are 5 countries whose cooperation is needed for any security measure to take effect because they have the most capacity, they may also have the most interests. Apart from that, it was also thought in 1945 when the UN was founded, that was really important to have these 5 countries involved in the UN, and without some special privileges, perhaps they would not be. So amongst those 5 are the United States and Russia. And for the privilege of being in the Security Council, you are able to cast a vote called a veto, which basically can block this mandatory action that otherwise all countries are obligated to undertake. So what happens? The Ukraine, in this case, on invasion by Russia, goes to the Security Council and says, we've been invaded, please help us. And they cite all kinds of violations of the UN Charter. So you see here in this picture in the center of the screen, the Ukrainian ambassador basically presenting the case. We have on the top the permanent representative of the United States, basically saying that yes, we should pay attention to this and we should take measures to basically tell Russia to stop. Not only to stop, but actually to remove itself from the territory of the Ukraine. And you have at the bottom the permanent representative of Russia, and the resolution fails because Russia casts its veto. So what happens after that is once this action is blocked, the United Nations General Assembly, which is the other one of the 6 principal organs, can take over. And indeed they did. And so they met in emergency session, which is unusual. It's only been 11 times the UN General Assembly has met in emergency session to take up a matter of peace and security. The UN is more than 75 years old, so it's not very frequently that this is done, basically to try to do what the UN Security Council could not do. And so a resolution was offered, put forward, and was approved by a vote of 141 to all the rest, many abstentions. There were just a few negative votes, 5 negative votes, one of which was cast by Russia. But in the case of the UN General Assembly, its pronouncements are more in the nature of a noting of actions. They cannot authorize or force any kind of behavior. They can recommend action. They can note that something of great moment has occurred. But what happens with even these words is that it could authorize others to start to do things. And so based on the General Assembly's resolution, we actually then see others coming into play. So the United States on its own already has put out some sanctions at this point. This is a picture of the North Atlantic Council. You remember the earlier slide of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, another treaty under which members bind themselves basically in a military alliance to defend each other should any of them be attacked. Now, in this case, Ukraine is not a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but yet NATO takes the position that the security of Ukraine is important to Euro-Atlantic security, which is what NATO's in the business of doing. And so as a result, it sort of softly allows NATO members to take actions, which it has, moving some forces around and basically being prepared not to enter into Ukraine, but at least to within the territory of the NATO countries, be prepared should the conflict spread or should there be required to be other forms of actions. We also have the European Union, which is an economic and political organization, a group of states. It's most prominently been in the news of late because of Brexit, because Britain decided to exit the European Union. But the European Union has as one of its goals to also cooperate more in the military and security space, but has not really been quite effective at doing so. So this is actually one of its first moments where it's tried to come together to act as a group. But what they did do was impose sanctions, which could hurt Russia because of the very close trading relationships between Russia and members of the European Union, particularly Germany. And hopefully we'll get a few minutes to hear a little bit more about that, particularly with regard to imports of gas and other natural resources. But the sanctions that were immediately imposed We're actually,
Maybe I could just add one thing when we're talking about regional organizations. One of the other organizations that's engaged to a degree is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is the successor organization to the Helsinki Accords. So between the Western Europe, the United States, Canada, and the Soviet Union, the Helsinki Accords were agreed on, which included human rights, a human rights basket and provisions. And at the end of the Soviet Union, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe became the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and it has a number of different pieces to it. One thing that the OSCE has is something called the Moscow Mechanism, which is an ability to investigate alleged human rights violations. And the Moscow Mechanism has been invoked. Ukraine, as a participating state to the OSCE, can request it, and 44 of the participating states of the OSCE have agreed. And basically what this does is opens up an investigation into the human rights situation in Ukraine and what's going on in terms of the conflict. So it's just one other tool that's out there.
so here are some initial sanctions, basically blocking of banking, access to banking, and flows of capital and things of this nature. So when the UN, going back to my brief discussion about the Security Council, when the Security Council mandates action, which it could not do in this case because of the Russian veto, but in its sort of toolkit, it also has sanctions, economic sanctions, breaking of diplomatic relations. Sorry. Oh, okay, louder. Okay, got it. Sorry. You can, the Security Council has a whole toolkit of activities that it can actually order states to do, including economic sanctions. Now, this failed because Russia blocked action by the Security Council, but this is, again, just in terms of international activity, something which is allowed and known as a way to punish wrongdoing, mostly to block the ability of the perpetrator to actually continue its wrongdoing, but it's also a form of punishment. It does also, obviously hurt the population within the country that's being sanctioned. So you have financial flows, cutting off of, other access to basically the international global economy. So that's okay.
Yeah. So I think we skipped over here. There we go. So obviously, one of the things that we've all been seeing pictures and really some heart-wrenching pictures of what's been going on within Ukraine. A good number of cities, including the second largest city, Kharkiv, has been under serious attack. Kyiv is under also attack, and people there are having to seek shelter. And the expectation is, if nothing changes within the next week or so, it's expected, if not sooner, that Russian forces will enter the city of Kyiv, which is the largest city in Ukraine. It's about the size of Chicago. If you're trying to think population-wise, what are we talking about here? That's what we're talking about. And you've got a large civilian population caught up in this. So what I have heard from my friends who have contacts with those in Ukraine is up until the Russian forces invaded, people in Ukraine didn't think this was going to happen. This was really a surprise. Now, it doesn't mean that the Ukrainian forces and the military wasn't prepared because they were, and we can see that. And it doesn't mean that they didn't expect that this was a possible thing. But your average Ukrainian didn't think, oh my goodness, I need to get out of here. And they weren't running for the borders. And what this means is a lot of people are in place where the fighting is happening, and they're having to find shelter. And of course, we'll talk in a minute about all those who are also trying to get out. There are old Soviet era bomb shelters in a variety of places. There's subway shelters, there's basements, but it's a serious problem, right? Ukraine is a modern developed country. It wasn't set up for warfare, right? And so most people are living in apartments, which are apartment buildings, which are extremely dangerous when you've got bombs and mortars and some of the really dangerous munitions that the Russians are throwing at them. So this is an immediate issue and an immediate concern. And when people are seeking shelter, they're obviously, the economy has ground to, I think, a complete halt in a whole lot of Ukraine at this point. Getting basic supplies of food and water water has been turned off, electricity is off in a lot of places. So just the basics of life, think about it, are not easily accessible or available in large parts of Ukraine. And people are forced into situations that we haven't seen in Europe since World War II. And we've seen in the Bosnian conflict, we obviously saw in the former Yugoslavia, but in these numbers and in people taking shelters in subway stations is really reminds us of what Britain faced with the Germans bombing the UK.
So what we were talking about a little bit earlier is basically state to state level. A state has violated international law, the community of states responds. They respond through resolutions of condemnation, they respond through sanctions. What we're turning to right now is what happens on the individual level, on the ground, and what kind of international law applies, and what potentially international law has been violated as well. Professor Alkon was just saying, food is running out. There is some evidence that Russian troops have been targeting, apartment complexes and residences. These are civilian targets, which are not considered to be targets of war and therefore should not be harmed. There is a distinction between those who are military and non-military targets. And if you're a military target, if you're in the midst of a war, well, it's sort of fair game. But if you're not military target, then this is normally thought to be something you should not touch. Power plants, we saw the capture of a power plant. It's a little questionable as to whether the power plant's a military target or not. You could probably argue that both ways, but in the main, this particular power plant for Ukraine was meant to service the civilian population and not for production of weaponry and armaments. What are called the laws of the law of humanitarian law, international humanitarian law that protects civilians, is most closely associated with the Red Cross. These are some of the symbols which are meant to be universally recognized as areas that should be basically evident as non-military targets. So hospitals often will carry these symbols, or relief workers. If you have humanitarian corridors, they will be marked with these kinds of symbols, and these are meant to be areas of protection. If you fail that, you actually violate international law, because there is law that says you should not be targeting civilians, and you can be held personally as well as collectively as a country accountable. And this we have since the end of World War II, a system of accountability through international trials. Some of you may have heard about the Nuremberg Trials that followed World War II, where individual German officials were for the first time really held accountable at an international level for violations against crimes against peace, which is basically going to war, crimes against war crimes, which are those where you target civilians, and you have crimes against humanity, which have to do with genocide and ethnic cleansing, and these are the things that we know today, which was a rather newer form of law at the time of the end of World War II, but as a result of the experience of World War II, gave rise to a whole new body of law that we see, that we recognize as the Convention on the Prevention of and Punishment on the Crime of Genocide, which this map shows that most of the world actually is party to this convention. Ukraine and Russia are both party to the convention, which is a basis upon which to say that Russia has potentially violated its international obligations because it's a member of a treaty. And once you've freely accepted treaty obligations, you are responsible. The photos that you saw before were, one was the bench of judges and the other were the accused in the dock. And we have now today international courts and tribunals, which are permanent institutions, something again quite novel since the beginning of the 20th century. The top photo here shows the International Criminal Court, and the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has what they call opened an investigation against the conduct of Russia in the Ukraine based on charges of genocide. And we have in the bottom the International Court of Justice, which is a court of countries. Only countries appear before the International Court of Justice. And Ukraine went to the International Court of Justice to ask for what's called provisional measures, which basically is an injunction to ask Russia to stop what it's doing. And the International Court actually held a hearing on Monday. Russia failed to appear at this hearing, but the court has said that it would give a judgment very, very shortly. Again, what effect might this have? This will only have effect if there are countries that are prepared to then execute these judgments and pronouncements, but they will carry with them ongoing liability and responsibility for the individuals associated with these conflicts for some time to come. So even if there's not any immediate effect to what the judgments and orders of these courts can accomplish, they will have effect going forward. So all of this to say is that since World War II, there has been a lot of international law, international institutions, international mechanisms, international organizations now at play to respond to situations such as the one that Russia has triggered by going into the Ukraine. Has it stopped Russia? Has it thrown Russia out of the Ukraine? No. But has it made it costlier for Russia to do this? I would say yes. And some of the effects of this may be yet costs to come. It's costs, however, that we as an international community will all have to bear because we are now quite a connected economy. And so what happens in a place like Russia, in a place like the Ukraine, will actually at some point in time also have effect against us, which was actually the guiding principle behind the United Nations, that we should maintain international peace and security, because as a community, as a global community, in the name of collective security, if there's anything that's going wrong in one part of the world, it potentially will harm all of us. And therefore we should carry collective responsibility to contain the situation as much as possible and to reverse it and repulse it as quickly as possible. But it's complicated to do. So.
Yeah, just one other note on the international tribunals. The International Criminal Court prosecutor about a week ago announced that he was opening an investigation. It was coming out of a request that Ukraine had previously made coming out of the 2014 invasion by Russia of Crimea. And he announced that it would include any human rights concerns that may come out of both the situation in Crimea and now the larger war that's going on as Russia invaded Ukraine. So refugees is an area, this is what I think has captured a lot of us in terms of our attention. It's being heavily reported on, in part because a lot of what's going on with the refugees is outside of Ukraine, so it's somewhat easier to report on than being in the midst of the war zone. But we've seen these heart-wrenching pictures of people fleeing. This picture is from Kharkiv a couple of days ago, which is, you may remember, right, is one of the cities that's been under serious bombardment. And you just can't even imagine the scene at that train station. And I think it's also worth noting, not only is there war going on, COVID is still very live and active in Ukraine. The vaccination rates are not as high as one would like. So in the midst of the panic and the chaos and the fear and the terror, we've also got a pandemic. And so just to be thinking of that too, and just another layer of the misery that people are facing there. And so we've had these, scene after scene. As a corgi lover, I had to, of course, include a picture of one of the many corgi pictures of there've been dogs and cats being taken out by their people. But when we talk about what's going on with refugees, so there's a few things that I think are important to note. We've got over 2 million people have fled Ukraine in less than 2 weeks. Tomorrow's the 2-week point. That's a tremendous amount of people. That's more people, more refugees than Europe has seen since World War II. A good number of these, so it seems like over 1 million have landed in Poland. Poland is a country that over the last many years has taken a very strong anti-immigrant stand. And there's been concerns about, there were Middle Eastern immigrants that were trying to pass through Belarus. There were political issues going on there in terms of the authoritarian President Lukashenko and what was going on in terms of helping facilitate those refugees coming through. But putting that aside, what Poland's response to that was to effectively shut the borders and be and it's got a right-wing government which has been very anti-immigrant. Well, that's not the situation with the bulk of refugees coming in from Ukraine. Poles, as with the other neighboring countries, are seeing Ukrainians as there, but for the grace of God go I think there's really no other way to put it. They understand what can happen with Russia as a near neighbor. They have had previous experiences of both war and Russian aggression, and they have been extraordinarily welcoming. The caveat to that is that there are people of color, students from Africa, students from the Indian subcontinent that have been studying in Ukraine or for whatever reason have ended up settling in Ukraine because there have been a lot of students from those regions. They have not been welcomed with open arms coming into the countries surrounding Ukraine, and they've had serious problems getting through borders. It seems ultimately people are getting through, but not without a lot of problems, and with that a lot of fear, threats to be sent back into the fighting. So I think it's important to note it hasn't been universal. And the other group of people that have faced real troubles at the border and beyond is Roma. And these are, it's an ethnic group that has lived in Europe for centuries and are a part of Europe, but are a group that is subjected to a tremendous amount of racism and prejudice. And that has not disappeared in this conflict, and it has been a problem for Roma who have been trying to cross over into the border. It's also been a problem in terms of what kinds of aid and assistance they're getting once they get into Poland or some of these other countries. One of the things too, I think also keep in mind, there are different estimates, or maybe one estimate I heard is they expect about 4 million refugees coming out of this conflict. I've also heard an estimate of up to 10 million, which would include internally displaced people. And so we're seeing a lot of movement within Ukraine. So people fleeing Kharkiv are going to the west, Lviv, which is one of the largest city on the west. There's a number of cities, but it's the largest one on the west. Has been inundated with people coming in and the whole Lviv region to escape the fighting that's going on in the east. And at this point, we have no clear numbers. It's too chaotic a situation. There's too much movement going on, but we know there's tremendous amounts of internally displaced people. Within the refugee population and within those in Ukraine, as Charlotte had mentioned, there's a lot of interconnections between peoples, which I think can get lost in some of the discussions. So Ukraine, when it was part of the Soviet Union, Ukrainians were moving to Belarus, to Russia, and vice versa. And so a lot of people sitting in these countries have connections, have family, close connections in all of these neighboring countries. A tremendous amount of Ukrainians have gone in recent years to Poland to work. And so what you saw in the initial period with refugees fleeing Ukraine, a lot of them were fleeing to family they had in Poland, right? It's a lot of the first wave was people who already had connections in. They knew they could quickly and easily get over the border and be housed. And one of the concerns that I've been hearing about in Poland, because Poland does not have a good structure for immigration, because it has been somewhat hostile to immigration, the state structures are poor. They're relying on private people, and the Poles have risen to the occasion, right? They are donating all kinds of things, opening their homes to people. It reminds me of what Albanians did coming out of the Kosovar crisis in 1998, when a large number of Kosovar refugees fled into Albania and were housed by individual Albanians. The same thing is going on, not just in Poland. Germans have also been doing this, right? But the problem is, as the next waves are coming, they're probably going to be more in need. They may be folks who have less ties into other places, less ability to immediately get themselves situated. They're going to need more aid. And we're seeing more vulnerable peoples leaving. We've been hearing reports of orphanages fleeing en masse into Poland and trying to figure out how to set things up for these kids who are amongst the most disadvantaged. So this is a real problem, that making sure that there's structures in place to aid people as they're fleeing both within Ukraine and becoming internally displaced people and in other countries. We clearly have a huge international effort here. A lot of multinational organizations, NGOs, and individual governments are also rising to the occasion to provide aid. But I think it's important to recognize that this is going to be ongoing. And one of the groups of people that I haven't heard a lot of talk about, when Belarus had its contested presidential election in the summer of 2020, there were large-scale demonstrations, unlike anything that Belarus has ever seen in its history. And the Belarusian government responded in a way that was also unprecedented, with brutality, with large-scale arrests, with beating, with torture of people who were protesting an election that by all accounts was not legitimate. By all accounts, except the official Belarusian government account. And one of the things that happened is a lot of Belarusians fled to Ukraine. And so you've got a number of people in Ukraine who are probably Belarusians trying to figure out what to do. One of them is a woman who I know personally, was a friend when I was working in Belarus. The former head of the Women's Lawyers Association in Belarus fled into Ukraine coming out of the demonstrations in 2020. I had initial contacts with her right as the war was starting, but haven't heard from her since. So, and she's just one of, I'm sure, many who are trying to figure out what now. As this place of refuge is no longer that. So I think one other point I wanted to make on this is that Europe has opened up its borders officially to refugees coming out of Ukraine and has allowed them 3 years of status, so legal status. So any refugee fleeing out of Ukraine who's Ukrainian, it's a little more complicated if they're a national of an African country where there are a number, and also of India. I'm not sure quite what the status is of those folks, but Ukrainian nationals have been granted 3 years of residency in the European Union. Okay, so I think just the final thing, because this has been in the news a lot, which is the protests. We've had protests around the world, including, of course, here in Texas. In every major city, I think, around the world, we've seen protests supporting Ukraine and opposing what the Russians have been doing. This has included protests in Russia, and there's been reports of large-scale arrests of thousands of people as these protests are happening. And I think it's important to note that there are protests happening in Russia, but I think it's also important not to give it a importance outside of where it probably sits. It's a small number relatively of people that are protesting, and Russia, as I think we've all been hearing, is shutting down media and information sources. So the subset of people who were understanding what was going on in Ukraine is getting probably smaller. And the impact that these protests are going to have on Russian policy, in my view, right now, is much of nothing. Which is not in any way, shape, or form to lessen the courage of the people who are protesting in Russia. They are putting themselves in physical danger, but I think we need to be mindful of what is the likely impact of those demonstrations within Russia. The other place where demonstrations have been happening is in Belarus. This is also someone who I knew from my time working in Belarus. She's a law professor, a criminal defense lawyer, Irina Kuchesvaya. She held up a sign that she made herself a week ago Sunday, where she was protesting the war in Ukraine and Belarus's involvement. There were elections going on to amend the Belarusian constitution to allow it to become a nuclear weapon-bearing state. And she stood with this sign outside of a polling place in Belarus and was quickly arrested. So far, I have not heard what's happened. She's been released, but obviously there's serious concerns because of the way Belarusian authorities have been treating, and more correctly, mistreating people who have been engaging in political protest. And I think in the English-speaking world, we've had less awareness of some of these protests that have been going on. There's less coverage of it. And I think what we need to be mindful of is, just as we're less aware of what's going on in the Russian-speaking world, in the Russian-speaking press, those in Russia are not accessing our press, right? Russia and the United States have a lot in common, one of which is that we are large countries. You can travel for days and never reach a border in both countries. Both countries tend to have populations that are monolingual. So just as most Americans speak only English, most Russians speak only Russian. And so that means the only access to information they have is that which is going to be in a language they can understand. And so I think it's just also important to keep that in mind as we're understanding what's happening in this region. And I think what we wanted to do now, let's stop. We have one of our wonderful colleagues, Professor Guillermo Garcia Sanchez is in the room, and he is an expert on, among other things, he's part of our dispute resolution group. He's also part of our natural resources group, and he is an expert in oil and gas. And so we wanted him to just say a few words about that piece of this conflict to add to the conversation. So you can just step to the microphone. Yeah, we'll be on camera. Yeah, if you face this way, like us, you'll be facing the, yeah, okay. You've got your back to us. Yeah, there we go.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
Okay. So now he's got his back to the audience. Yeah. So apologies.
So just a couple of and I have to talk more about it if you have more questions in the Q&A. But yesterday, President Biden, everybody heard it, announced the blocking of Russian sales of Russian oil into the United States. This was, to me, you know, and the students, I see a couple of my students in class, to me, this was really the nuclear option that the West was trying to avoid. Because if you look at the government, the Russians' budget, around 40% of the government budgets come from the sale of natural gas and oil. And the Russians have been actually capitalizing from the spike on the prices. One of the curious aspects of conflict is that even though the war is raging in Ukraine, the pipelines that bring natural gas from Russia into Western Europe are still operating, and they go through Ukraine as well. And so, you know, that sale of natural gas went up 38% just the first week of conflict. So again, in a curious situation, the West is still financing, in a way, the war. So yesterday's move by President Biden was an important first step. Now, the United States still imports, out of all of its international imports, only represents 3%, so it's a small amount. So the U.S. is in a good position to face the spikes. But compared to Europe, where 34%, just think about it, 34% of the electricity produced in Western Europe comes from natural gas and oil from Russia. So that's, you know, that is one of the reasons why the European nations have been less willing to impose that type of sanctions on them, because then the spike of prices is going to skyrocket, and probably even Russia is already threatening to shut down the pipelines, and that would basically shut down the electricity in Western Europe. So this all is also, you know, we can have a whole lecture on energy transition and why energy transition also has components of energy security. The Germans have been trying to expand their renewable capacity precisely to be less dependent on Russia. Unfortunately, you know, that didn't move as quickly as they wish. They're going to hear a lot of criticism of the Germans, but they were able to reduce from 34% to now 18% the dependency of Russian natural gas to renewable energy. But so just to leave it there, you know, this is just starting. The Russians also were preparing for this. Let's just say that. They moved some of the sanctions on the banks. They moved their foreign reserves to a different currency. So that started in 2017 when the invasion of Crimea. So they've been preparing for this situation. And some of the numbers that I saw is that they can hold financially the war at least for a year and a half up to 2 years. And that's when obviously the money is going to start running out of their reserves.
Thank you. So I think we will open it up for questions from the audience, and maybe as the folks who are live in the room are thinking about it and coming up to the microphone, because we'll need you to come to the microphone to ask your question. We do have a question in the chat from Professor John Landy from Missouri asking about NATO and saying that some have criticized NATO for expanding closer to Russia, which Russia would feel is threatening. A related criticism is that NATO should have encouraged Russia to become part of NATO. What do you think of these criticisms? So, you know, clearly this is a part of it. One of the things that happened at the end of the Soviet Union, there were assurances made that NATO would not expand, and then it did. And I think there's a couple things to think about with that. I mean, first is that sovereign nations should have a right to do something like join an alliance. And so, you know, we were probably at the get-go unrealistic about making those assurances and binding the hands of sovereign nations in terms of what they might want to join or do into the entire future. I think that was an unrealistic thing to have said, but the fact that it was done is certainly a piece of this. The Russians had an expectation; it's not been fulfilled, and I think we also need to remember the historical context. I mean, when we think of NATO, we think of all things benign, and that's a good thing. And we like the idea of NATO and what it speaks to overall, right? And that tends to be how we are looking at NATO. And when you look at how the Russians look at NATO, it is not that view at all. During the Cold War, it was NATO and it was the Warsaw Pact. And there's not that fluffy, warm feeling that NATO has our best interest at heart, feeling that a lot of Western European countries have about NATO, and the United States has about NATO. That is not the Russian perspective on it. And to see NATO coming in everywhere along the outer borders of Russia is a concern. And I don't know that Russia would have ever agreed to join NATO because I think because of this existing history and the perceptions and ideas of what NATO is. So I appreciate the question, Professor Landy, but I don't know.
I think, let me just throw one thing in, which is also geopolitics. If you think about the United States, and if you recall the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Soviet incursion into Cuba, in the United States, we consider the Western Hemisphere sort of our preserve. And in some ways, Russia feels this way too. They too want a security barrier around them, the way we historically have asserted that we have special interests in our area. So this is for additional other discussion, but the idea that you care about who your neighbors are is not something peculiar only to Russia. In fact, China has this, the United States certainly has this, and there's a lot of history and war that goes along with those views of how secure you need to be. So.
Do we have questions in the room? Yes, we've got somebody. Come to the microphone, please.
Thank you for your time. By all accounts, sorry, I'm not used to hearing that.
It's an unusual command in this.
By all accounts, Ukraine is going to lose the conventional war fairly quickly. Is the UN's response to this going to take long enough that we're basically going to be asked to accept Russian control of the Ukraine while they sort this out, barring a intervention of some sort? And if so, could that potentially catalyze some structural changes at the UN, given Russia's position on the Security Council and the impact that has on the UN's ability to respond that you talked about earlier?
So maybe I'll start first with the question. Looks like we've got a little bit of freezing going on in the internet. I hope that will fix itself. I'll start first with this, that by all accounts, Ukraine is going to quickly lose. I think we need to not accept that. That may not be what's happening here. And I have talked with a very good friend of mine who is a British expert in things military, and he has told me that the Ukrainians, I think one of the things that perhaps has also been missed in this, in 2014, the Ukrainians were very unprepared for what happened in Crimea. Their military was unprepared for it. Since then, there's been a lot going on in Ukraine. And I think the ability of them holding back the Russians at this stage is a reflection of that. Now, it doesn't mean that there isn't going to be brutality, and it doesn't mean they're not going to go into Kiev. I think that seems pretty clear. It's a question of when, not if. But what I have been told is that they really do think that there is the ability, particularly if Russia doesn't seem to get it together more in terms of what their military is doing, their supply lines, their logistics are a serious problem, and that's seriously holding back what they're able to do, and they don't seem to have been prepared going into this. So one of the things that apparently American intelligence is saying, and I can't say I've got any special road into this, but apparently it's been, it is being reported, is that the Ukrainians on some level can hold on for 8 to 10 years. This is not something that is good. It doesn't mean every city holds, but it can be a highly complicated and complex place for Russia. First of all, it's proven not to be so easy for them to go in. And second of all, it may not be so easy for them to hold what they get. And third, they may not be able to get all, right? And so I think that's just to keep in mind, like we don't know, right? So I wouldn't take as a given that it's going to be a quick and easy thing for Russia to take it, but then we're turning it over.
It's a large territory. And so it doesn't seem likely that the Russians are going to want to mount an occupation force for the entire territory, even if they can do that. It's not so easy to occupy a country. There are other forms of international recognition that can remain for Ukraine, even if it loses part of its territory. So the military action and results is one thing. The consequences and what the international community does about that is yet another thing. With regard to the UN Security Council, of course, reform of the UN Security Council, who should be a member, particularly holding veto, and all of this has been going on for decades. But you can imagine that if you sit in a privileged position, it is unlikely you're going to wish to give it up. And right now, the United States may not be happy about the Russian veto, but there has been more than one occasion where the United States has also cast a veto for reasons which we believe appropriate to the circumstance in our interests. So it's a difficult question, a reasonable one to ask, but one that's not so easy to answer.
Other questions? Yeah, if you can come up to the microphone, please. That's someone you can see on the screen walking up to the microphone.
This thing on here? All right. Thank you very much for having this discussion. I think it's very timely and very effective at spreading information. So I have two questions. The first one is if you could comment about the conscription of Ukrainian men aged 16 to 60, in particular in terms of personal responsibility to A, defend one's country, and B, to help facilitate the evacuation of children and especially women, given the confirmed reports of war rape happening in cities like Kherson and Mariupol. And the second one, if you could talk about Putin's claims of denazification of Ukraine, given the history of Ukrainian involvement in the Holocaust and killing of Poles, and also units such as like the Azov Battalion, which are confirmed being Nazis. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to be aware, Ukraine has had some sort of draft and conscription that's been ongoing. This is not new. What is new is that anyone of even broadly speaking military age, any man between the age of 18 and 60 is blocked from leaving the country, so that they're available to aid in the defense of Ukraine. What this means is that the refugee crisis is largely one of saving children and their mothers or other female family members. Sometimes it's grandmothers who are going with them, but it's largely about the children, and that's what I've been hearing from friends. It's really about saving the children. That's what this refugee surge has been about. One of the things that we know from war is that people who are less advantaged and less powerful are often the first and most serious victims of it. And so sexual assault, rape is a part of war and has been recognized as a war crime fairly recently. It was officially recognized in the tribunals coming out of the conflict in Yugoslavia. So that is one of the many disturbing and difficult realities facing any people in the midst of war, and it is something that the international tribunals will be looking at, and there will be, I'm sure, evidence being collected. One of the things to be aware of is that the process of collecting evidence is already started. Right, international organizations are already in the process with it. I've seen calls for people who are Russian and Ukrainian speaking to be able to start working. And one of the key things that often happens in these kinds of situations is interviewing of refugees as they come over the border. And the first group coming over the border were left before the fighting, right? The groups that are starting to come now are people who are probably have seen more and been involved in more. And so interviewing these folks as they're coming out is a piece of the evidence gathering that's going to be going on. And maybe just on the claim of denazification, I think the bottom line is everyone recognizes that was a complete pretext on Putin's part, that Ukraine is an independent nation. The president of Ukraine is Jewish, and he has family who were killed in the Holocaust. So as a personal thing for him, he has made very strong statements against that because of the complete absurdity of it coming out of who he is and what his family history is. And I think, unfortunately, it is playing with some quarters in Russia, people who are less informed and are, as we talked about, have access to less information and maybe more prone to believe the propaganda. And the propaganda is all consuming. in parts of Russia. We need to be well aware of that, just as we've seen propaganda, disinformation campaigns work well in this country. Thinking of things like, anti-vaccine and some of the things that have gone on around COVID, we've been as susceptible to these kinds of campaigns. So I think it's important to understand there's nothing unique in Russia. Russia's good at it. And we certainly know they've done it in this country, right? And they are good at that, but it's a piece of what's going on with it. But in terms of, is there any validity to this claim? Of course not. Now, in Ukraine, do they have a far right who is anti-Semitic? Absolutely. That whole part of the world suffers from historic anti-Semitism, and there's no question. And there are, the unit that you referred, there are some groups in Ukraine that are Ukrainian nationalists, and the way that that their form of nationalism shows up is through anti-Semitism. This is something that has happened historically in Ukraine through the millennia. Ukraine and Belarus were part of what's called the Pale of Settlement, which is under Tsarist Russia. Jews were prohibited from living in most of Russia. They were allowed to live in the Pale. You've heard of the term beyond the Pale, right? That's where it comes from. And Ukraine and Belarus were the Pale of Settlement. So they have large Jewish populations. When the Germans came in, there were large-scale slaughters of the Jews that were living there. Babi Yar, which is one of the sites that is a known place where a tremendous amount of Jews were killed by the Germans and Ukrainians who were assisting. There is a monument to it as one of the things that was recently hit by mortar fires, apparently the monument to Babi Yar. So yeah, the history with Jews and anti-Semitism is complicated, it's long-standing in this region. And also we need to recognize that we're in a different place, right? When you've got a Jewish president of Ukraine, that is a first. That's a historic first, and it speaks to something that's different. Right? I think it's important to recognize that.
Just a couple of things to add to that. President Zelensky's first language actually was Russian, so I guess it also shows you, how blended this community is. On the matter of military personnel and conscript and the like, you may also have heard that people are volunteering to go and serve in the military in Ukraine, and Ukrainian consulates, I guess, are open to do this. The rules that attach to that are that if you do that, you're on your own responsibility. The laws of war don't cover you because you are not actually a formal military person of one of the belligerent countries. Nonetheless, over history, we've had episodes and occasions where there are whole fighting units that actually have volunteered for service because they sympathize with one or the other side of a conflict and got involved prior to the involvement of their governments. Ultimately, how governments will be involved, how the UN will be involved, it is yet to be seen. There are talk about putting in international forces to serve as buffers between the warring parties, which might be a face-saving way out at some point in time, just to freeze the conflict. So as I think Professor Alkon has said already, these are early days in what will be a very long haul here in terms of activity in this area, with a lot of consequences and results yet to come. So.
We have other questions. Someone else coming up to the microphone. And we've got some students who've got classes, so they're going to be leaving, but we'll hang on for another 15 or 20 minutes. So if people have questions, we're happy to hang on. So
I have a quick question for you, and possibly also for Professor Garcia Sanchez. But if we're looking at the prospect of some form of conflict continuing for years, perhaps even a decade, even if it shifts from a conventional war to some form of insurgency, and right now we're seeing gas continuing to flow through Ukraine into Europe. Are there any prospects for other European countries following in the United States' footsteps and perhaps further down the line, cutting off all energy imports or ratcheting up even beyond the sanctions we're seeing right now? Thanks.
I think Professor Garcia Sanchez can speak to it, but
Europe has also actually made a commitment to stop purchasing a lot of this and going towards more renewable sources of energy. So they've actually already taken a step in that direction, but I think, which just happened.
So I know some of the reports have come out, at least from Germany side, that they are increasing the renewable energy capacity to move towards sanctioning the purchase of natural gas. The US is also to do a better job. One of the big advancements, at least in the international energy markets, was the possibility of actually shipping liquefied natural gas, right? That's a game changer. We can actually supply the natural gas they are purchasing from Russia. Potentially, we could supply it from the United States or from other regions. The problem is the terminals. You need to have special terminals to download all that natural gas and supply it. So there's some infrastructure that needs to be built in case this conflict continues. But also, it all depends on how much pain we want to get in terms of the rising prices here, because every gallon that we ship somewhere else, or any natural gas container we ship or somewhere else, is going to be one that's going to impact our domestic markets. So prices here are going to go higher. So there's a whole conversation happening. Unfortunately, the conflict happened right after COVID. And as you remember, there was a point in time where actually prices of oil were actually negative, right? Because we had an oversupply and we didn't have enough demand because everything shut down. So many of the companies are months behind in terms of increasing their production. One of the fallacies that you're going to hear a lot in the media right now is that there's a lot of pressure to open up drilling in federal lands, but there's a lot of pressure to go and purchase oil from Venezuela, for example. Those are fallacies, because even if, let's say, tomorrow we open all federal land for drilling, it's not going to happen from one day to another, right? It's not like you're going to put straw and then suddenly oil is going to come out and that's going to impact the gas that you're pumping into your vehicle. That is not going to happen. Usually, especially like, let's say, for example, an offshore drill rig in the Gulf of Mexico, it takes 8 years for that to reach full development, right? So that's not going to have a direct impact on the oil and gas. Shale producing, that's a little bit different. Maybe you can get one up in the next 6 to 8 months running, but it's not going to have a direct impact now. Same thing with Venezuela. Even if we lift the sanctions on Venezuela, the Venezuelan petroleum industry is such in a bad state that you need to bring investment in order for those fields to actually start producing enough petroleum to lower the prices. So it's not going to happen from one day to another. This is all in the middle of influx, and depends on how long. But renewable energy, I think, is on the short run where it's going to help some of these countries to ease at least the dependency on natural gas from Russia. But it's not going to be a full ease. There are other alternatives, and I think the current administration is thinking on how they can work with those alternatives.
And one of the discussions I've heard also in terms of alternative energy, obviously countries like France are heavy users of nuclear power. And this morning, of course, we all woke to the news that the Chernobyl plant, electricity has been cut off to Chernobyl, which is a problem in terms of they need to have electricity to keep the core cool to prevent more radiation leakage. And Ukraine, as we also heard from Professor Koo, right, has a number of nuclear power plants. About 50% of its electricity comes from nuclear. And so I think there's also an open question, is it going to spur the development of more nuclear power plants in Europe, and whether that might be part of what's going on. From my perspective, looking at it in terms of the larger policy issues, having energy independence leads to independence in other things too, and I think that's not a bad thing. When we look at how the European Union and certainly how Germany, some of its foreign policy, I think, has been influenced by their energy dependence. And over the longer term, right, it's not something, as Professor Garcia said, is going to happen in the immediate term, but over the longer term, that might be a silver lining coming out of this, is to have more energy independence so countries can be making decisions based on what they think is the right thing to do, not based on the need for oil.
The other player in all of this, which we have not really discussed today, is China. China is also a consumer of natural resources. The Russian economy was not so much facing in that direction. It is interesting that China abstained in the Security Council against the resolution which condemned Russia. So it did not join Russia in vetoing it, but it did abstain. And so it will be interesting to see what China's role is. China's payment system, banking system, these are the backups now for Russia to use now that the West has cut it off of those banking networks. So we are in a global economy and there's some other players out there. So we should not focus just only unto ourselves. We need to look globally in order to understand actually what is happening.
We've got one question in the chat. Maybe we'll make that our last question. So can you expand upon what kind of judgments the International Court of Justice can render against Russia and what effect those judgments will have? And that's from one of our students, Stacy Slaughter.
Okay. So typically a judgment can find a country as violating international law. And then you normally can go into another phase of a court proceeding to basically ask for damages. And so there can be reparations that are mandated, that are required. And what that enables a country to do is essentially seize or freeze the monies that may be within the territory of the aggrieved party. That might help to sort of pay for some of the judgment. There could be other forms of punishments, but often these have to be then negotiated amongst the parties to basically make them happen. If you're on the losing side, it's unlikely you're going to volunteer you send a check to the other side. So there need to be some other actions that are taken, but often these will be in the form of at least authorizing seizure of bank accounts and things of this nature. If you're very interested in this, the United States does this against Iran because we have numerous claims against Iran on various matters. And the International Court has found that Iran has violated one or another of its obligations and basically has authorized the United States to seize and freeze assets such as we know they exist in the United States. So that's one form of enforcing a judgment.
So we do have one more question, so I'm going to ask it, and obviously people need to leave. But what would be the consequences for Russia if it were to retreat from Ukraine? How will the relationship with Ukraine be in the long run? And that's from Catherine Monet, I think is how we pronounce that. I may have that wrong, so apologies. It's a huge question, right? I mean, this is it's so hard to even see how this ends, right? And it's hard to see where either Russia or Ukraine are at the end of this. I think it's one of the big challenges when we're looking at this. It's I think the terrifying part of this is that it is hard to see how this ends, and it's really hard to see how this ends in terms of where either country sits in the future. Where right now Russia is very isolated. It's got a few other countries that are sticking with it. They are also not democratic countries, but it's hard to see how there's anything resembling normal relations between Russia and Ukraine moving forward. But I think arguably there haven't been for a long time, if ever, normal relations. And there's, I think, a serious misperception on the part of Putin that Ukraine is really not an independent country and that it isn't a place with an independent identity. And I think, ironically, what he's doing now is probably shoring up Ukrainian identity unlike any other thing that has been done. I mean, we're seeing reports. I mean, when I was traveling in the region when I first got there in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, the eastern part of Ukraine was very Russian and Russian speaking, and it was, they were part of Ukraine, but didn't necessarily have a strong Ukrainian identity. And over the years, it's gotten stronger, and we're seeing reports now. And you've got people like President Zelensky who are Russian speaking, who learned Ukrainian and are part of the Ukrainian nation and see themselves as Ukrainian. And you've also got people now who are in the eastern part of Ukraine. It's one of the perhaps ironies of this whole situation is that people getting hit the hardest are in the traditional Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine. This is the Ukrainian-speaking, traditional Ukrainian parts in the West. And a lot of these folks are having the reaction that you would expect them to have. They're angry at Russia. They're angry at this horrific disruption to their lives, to the taking of life, to the tragedy that is befalling them. And their reaction to this is not to embrace any Russian identity they might have had in their family history, but instead to embrace a Ukrainian identity. And so I think we are seeing, and will likely continue to see, continued strengthening of the Ukrainian identity in places where it might have been a little bit weaker. So this is one of the things that also makes it challenging. And I don't think that Putin, he can strike me as the most empathetic a character, so I suspect he didn't think this one through, right? This part of it, that what this would have on people's identity and their reaction to it. But in terms of thinking through where the future relations sit.
But over long term, if there is the desire to do so, political systems and structures are possible. We have had historic enmities. You know, the reason the European Union even exists is because France and Germany wanted to overcome what for them had been a historic enmity. So there are ways, once you decide that you actually want to put war away and live together somehow, to come up with something that works. And it is likely over time that something in this area will be allowed to allow for your own identity and independence, but yet close associational relationships with neighboring countries. This is natural. I mean, in the United States, we've tried this a lot, also in the Western Hemisphere, with varying degrees of success. But nevertheless, if you have the desire to do that, and you come with a certain level of respect and understanding for another side, and even for areas where you will not agree, you can always agree to put that aside. We will associate with you in this manner, but we put these other matters aside. So there are all kinds of political possibilities once there is that desire to do so. But that's the big if, when you have the desire to do so.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges, I mean, a lot of these historic examples that we've seen are with changes in leadership, that change can then come. And so as long as Putin remains in power, it becomes really hard to think of how that happens with his, at least what we see of his mindset. So. All right, so I want to thank everyone for being part of this conversation, both online and in person. So thank you very much.